And when we talked, I was like, yeah, so the number has changed. The number has gone up. I'm charging 22.5K for specifically the thing that you've asked for. And these are the reasons why. And she was like, okay, Melinda, what?
Tell me where you were before you took a boot camp. What was going on in your life, business, mindset?
Yeah, okay. So before the boot camp, I was struggling. I was struggling. So at this point, I had just gotten another client and like desperately needed this client, right? And I don't even remember what it was that I was charging at the time, but it was not enough. And this client was sort of like I'd already had indicators that they were going to be kind of a tough client, like a little quarrelsome. And so like I was kind of scared of that too. And this client was a design client, and I have to say that I didn't go to school for design, right? I always had this insecurity about my design, especially because at this point I was still trying to figure out how people made design choices and decisions, right? I was like, okay, like you picked this blue, why, how, like how did this happen? Because otherwise it just felt sort of like weird and arbitrary to me. And if it was weird and arbitrary, then like I didn't have a leg to stand on when it came to like saying how much I wanted to charge and like the sort of ROI you might get on this, right? Which is like what business owners are concerned about. And so like I was like deep in the middle of that situation where I was like spiraling, trying to figure out how to like what foundation to put my decisions on when it came to the work that I was doing for my clients. And I had this client that I desperately needed to make happy. And he was like going to be kind of like a difficult client. And I was just like exhausted. Like I was so tired. I was so tired. I remember that I had just started a fellowship at the same time with like a nonprofit that was doing like international diplomacy work. This is the other part of my life. And I did that because I was like, I'm not making enough just doing what I'm doing. Right. And so, like, I need to pull in this other part of my life so that I can, like, supplement things. And that ended up being a blessing. And, we'll get to that later. So that's sort of where I was. Like, I was overworked. I was exhausted. I was not making or charging enough for what I was doing. The stuff that I was doing in terms of design was like not like it made me anxious. Like it always made me anxious whenever I had a design project come through. And I was doing like a lot of searching for answers and like trying to like establish my own methodology and what have you. So like that's where I was, and it was like not great.
Yeah,
Not
and
great.
that specifically was about 2 years ago,
Mhm.
right? So 2019, 2019, because
Yeah.
you came to the beta version of the boot camp
Mhm.
late 2019. So now it's been almost 2 years, year
Yeah.
and a half, 2 years.
Mhm.
Where are you now? What's going on right now?
Okay, so and it's funny because I'm looking over and I have what I call my emotional support baby Yoda. It's like a giant plushie that's like the size of my torso. So whenever I look at it, I'm just like, "Hmm." And I got it to celebrate the milestone that I hit right now. And so, so that milestone is that I just charged 22.5K for a project. And this client is a dream client. They were like they just get it, right? Like there's no the questions that they ask are sort of like insightful questions. They sort of want to like I don't even know how to describe like the caliber of questions that this client asked, but it's like right up my alley. I love this. I feel like I have so much more space now to sort of like explore and use all the gifts and all the like weirdness with my brain and how I think to like bring about this outcome that she's looking for. And in fact, we had a check in like last week or the week before, and I just sort of checked in to see how she was feeling at the end of getting all the information that I needed and having her look at some stuff that we developed. And she was like, yeah, I feel like this is money well spent. And that was crazy to me. A, because it's more than I've ever charged in my entire freaking life. B, because in my head I'm like, I could charge more. Like this is limitless. Like what I'm doing is worth more than I'm even charging right now. And C, like one of the first things that she mentioned in our first strategy session was, I want to feel like this is the best investment I've made in my business. So to have her like maybe 3 weeks later say this feels like money well spent is just like, what? Like it's amazing. It's incredible. And it's not as heavy a lift. Like I'm really solid when it comes to like what I'm doing and how I want to go about doing that. I mentioned before that it was sort of a blessing that I ended up doing that fellowship at the same time. And that's because I finally got to see how like these two parts of my lives, my business and like this international diplomacy stuff that I do, like I got to see how they connected. And once that happened, I was just sort of like, oh, okay. Cool, 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 cool. I see what you're doing. Like I see what you've been trying to reach for. So like that has sort of like solidified my positioning, right? Which is another thing that definitely led to this. Like my positioning is sick if I do say so myself. So and I like there's no way I would have gotten to that positioning if not for this boot camp. Like I'm not exaggerating at all. And or if I had, it would have been like 2 years from now. Do you know what I mean? Like it would have taken me so much longer to get there. So I have to say, like the part of the boot camp where you have the students like work with each other, priceless. Don't ever change that because that's a huge part of what sort of like informed my thinking on like the space that I want to occupy in like this industry. So that's where I am now. Like oh my goodness, like I'm so well rested. I'm so well rested. I feel like I have more control than I did then. The question of how designers or other folks who were trained in this make design choices, I don't care anymore. Like the way I do it is better for me, right? Like the way that I make design choices, like for me is rock solid. I can't imagine doing it any other way. That's why like folks who do design without strategy, I'm just like, how do you do it? How? Like so the way that I do it is just like I always feel super confident in terms of the product that I roll out or the service that I roll out. And that's another thing that I'm sort of starting to shift away from design, and that's been interesting and that's been fun. Like I'm doing more creative direction. It doesn't mean that I don't have design folks come through. I still do, but now I actually have a designer that I've sort of brought in-house to do like the actual design work for me, which is amazing. So all I have to do is like the bits that I really love, which is sort of like the nerdy sciencey bit that like informs the design choices and like provide some direction and then just like let them do their thing and then come back and sort of be like, well, based on my research, I think maybe tweak this way, add this, take this away. Like it's just so much better. It's so much better.
So really
Yeah.
quick, you went from doing all the design yourself, not doing strategy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Before
Well, doing a little bit of strategy, like
doing a
just
little
like a
bit.
tiny bit of strategy, not good strategy.
And what would you say your average project, how much would you charge for that?
Oh my
Like
gosh.
average.
Let me think. I wasn't even charging 5K. Like
Well, let's just say you were. Let's just bump you up,
it's just
right?
like a very generous roundup of like
Yeah.
maybe a couple
Let's just,
$1,000,
yeah,
sure.
let's just round you up. So even if you were, okay, would you say it's 2,500 or 5,000? Which one would you?
I would say that it's let's say three. Let's say
Three. Okay.
3,000. Yeah.
So you went from charging roughly 3,000 for an average project a couple years ago to now you're charging 20.
Yeah.
Huge. And I know it's not just about the money. I realize that. I think it's just those are easy, sticky ideas for us to latch onto,
Yeah,
anchors.
exactly.
And I realize it's not about that, but you're now able to step away from design if you wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
You can do that. You have the space to hire a designer. You have
Mm-hmm.
the brain space, I'm sure, to work through the strategy. And then it sounds like too, you're attracting a completely different client type of
Yeah.
person.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you have
And
less
like
stress, but then an abundance of all these other great things.
Yeah. And this is the thing, right? Like this client did not quibble on price at all. She like, and it was somebody who had, and this is funny, right? I didn't mention this before, but this is somebody who had been referred to me before. I charged them like maybe half this much. And they were like, cool, like I'm ready to start. And then like life sort of got in the way. They're like, look, can we postpone until like life gets a little less crazy, right? And I was like, yeah, that's totally fine because I was in a better place than I was when I started this journey 2 years ago. So somebody saying like, can I postpone this, like was not devastating and didn't mean that like I would never speak to this person again, which is like what would happen before. And so I reached back out to her like maybe 8 months later to just sort of be like, hey, wanted to check in, like genuinely checking in on how like she was doing. There was like a big move that was happening and all this stuff. And also letting her know that like I tweaked my service and like if she was interested or like if her team was ready to do this now, like, then we should talk. And she was like, yes, I'm very much ready to do this. Like, let's talk. And when we talked, I was like, yeah, so the number has changed. The number has gone up. I'm charging 22.5K for specifically the thing that you've asked for. And these are the reasons why. And she was like, okay. Melinda, what? She was just like, okay. And like, mind you, I'd like had a little bit of practice, like saying that number with a straight face, of course, right? But like, I understood why the number was like that, right? So like I wasn't nervous to say that number because it didn't feel worth it. I was nervous in that scenario because it was twice as much as I had charged her like 8 months ago. And like that's where the tension came from. And she was still like, okay, like I think you're the person for the job. Like I've talked to a bunch of other people. There's one person who's like, you're definitely the most expensive by far, but like I want to work with you. You're the one I want to work with. And she told me that there was another person who had been talking to them and they were like a contender and they were like really excited to work with her, but like they charged her 2,500, which I'm just like, I remember when. And she was saying like, what can you really do for me for 2,500? Like you can't really help me for that number. And so like the fact that she trusted me enough to be like, I'm talking to these other people, these are the numbers, and she wasn't trying to coerce me to lower my number. She was telling me this is the landscape, and even given this, I still want to work with you. Like you're the one that I want to work with. Like actual dream. And she's been a dream client. Like working with her has been so easy breezy. It's been great. Like my process is to the point where like we'll check in, and like it's been like this for a while where like I rarely get anything remotely resembling a revision at this point. Like I rarely have someone say this is completely off, right? Or have someone say, oh, can we make some major changes? Like that hasn't happened in like a year and a half. Yeah, that hasn't happened in a year and a half. Like I don't know her. That chick, I don't know her. But like it's amazing to have that happen at the price point that I'm operating at right now, right? Because like if there were going to be major revisions, a 22.5K project would be the project where you'd have the space to do that. But there's nothing. She's just like, yeah, you guys are really on track. Like I love this. Like you're translating my vision really, really well. I like love the fact that I'm getting to know my people better. Like just chef's kiss. She loves it. And I love doing it. So like, yeah, I'm very, yeah.
Well, congratulations. That's huge. That's huge. And I'm sure such a weight lifted off your shoulders where you had to work so hard for such a little bit of a payoff, and then trouble with revisions and whatnot too. Yeah. Being trusted, which is massive.
Yeah.
Being trusted. And then I would imagine that trust also helps you trust yourself to then figure it out and do a good job too.
Yes, so absolutely. It totally does. And like it's funny that you mentioned this because I completed this week what will hopefully be the last logo that I work on directly or by myself for a different client that's overlapping with this one. And I was like really self-conscious about it. I don't know why. Like I haven't felt that self-conscious in a really long time. But I reached out to one of my friends in the boot camp and I said, hey, could you like just take a look at this and let me know like what you're thinking, like what instinctually what's going on when you look at this. And they gave me some thoughts and like they're like, this is great. I really like this. Have you considered trying this? And I tried this and we were both like, ooh, right. And so like it was just like this just really awesome group of folks that I can reach out to at any point and be like, hey, like what do you think about this? Just bouncing something off of. And after sort of like having that talk with my friend, I was like, okay, cool. Like I feel better about this. And then like went into the sort of brand presentation and the client was like, ooh, right? She like loved it immediately. Like there was no problem whatsoever. And she even said, she says, I see why you call yourself a brand scientist now. This really is like a science. And I was just like, I was like, oh no, oh my God, I'm gonna cry. So yeah, like things are just night and day. Night and day.
So yeah, definitely sounds like that. So I'm hearing a couple things. I'd love to ask you too, like if someone's watching this and they're like, okay, cool, I'm you before, or at least around there, and I want what you have. I want those types of clients and all that. I heard a couple things of what got you there. One, friends,
Mm-hmm.
friends that you trust and that you can get feedback from, and your own positioning. So
Yeah.
what other things, if anything, can you think of that helped you get from where you were to where you currently are?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I will say that it all started for me, I think, with the strategy session that I did in the beta strategy sessions. I was paired with Nick. Thank the Lord for that. Because Nick is just like anyone who's watching this probably knows who Nick is, but like Nick is like my bosom friend. Like he's like we're like this. I love him so much. And like we became so close throughout this process. So like that's another gift. But as we were doing like going through the exercises, like I already had sort of like ideas about the fact that like my approach was like kind of objective and like a little sciency and like I have like inklings of that in my head and like that sort of existed in my positioning but like not in a really concrete way. And so after sort of having the strategy session and just like being able to see all of my brain as it pertained to my business like in front of me in a document, right, as opposed to like thinking about it here, I had it in front of me so I could study it better. Like after doing that and like sort of looking through all of his like really great insights, some of which like still to this day are like guiding the work that I do, even though he'll tell you like, oh my God, it was like shite is what he would say. It's like, it's a shite. Like it's not good. It was totally useless and overwhelming. I was like, no, like there's still stuff that I use in here, dude, chill. After doing that, I was sort of able to see, oh, okay. Like I see what you're trying to hit with this. And that allowed me to sort of refine my positioning. And so that's one thing, right? Those strategy sessions really help a lot. Just like having somebody reflect back at you. One of Nick's favorite quotes is actually a quote I told him that my dad says, which is you can never be your own mirror. And I think that's why this process was so amazing for me because like I finally had a mirror and I could like see better like where I was trying to get to, the stuff that was standing between me and getting there, and like what I was trying to bring with me. So that's one thing. I think also once I felt like I had the brand strategy process down, the next thing that I ended up needing to do or figure out was, okay, so like, what am I going to do with this tool, right? Like a question that I've heard a lot of folks ask who are like getting into brand strategy or like have done like a full course, maybe your course, maybe somebody else's course, is like, how do I explain what brand strategy is? Like, how do I explain what it does? And like, what I realized is that like, the reason for that is because it's such an amazing tool, right? If you understand brand strategy, you can solve pretty much any problem that a brand has, right? And I like feel totally confident saying that. And that's like any brand, right? Like I've worked with a lot of different kinds of brands. I've worked with like mom and pop shops. I worked with a small island nation, right? Like they all have brands. And even though the problems can present themselves differently, right? Like brand strategy is a tool that you can still use to like solve those things, right? So brand strategy is a really powerful tool. And because it's so powerful and because you can really solve any problem with it, folks don't really know how to describe what it does. And like the solution to that for me has been figuring out, okay, what brand problem do I want to solve? Like, what do I want to do? What's going to feed me if I solve it for other folks? And if I solve it for the folks that I want to work with? And so I spent like 6 months or so after the boot camp trying to figure out what that was for me. And then once I figured out, okay, like this is the problem that I want to solve, that I want to fix in the world, I realized, okay, cool. Now it's time for me to go back to the toolkit that Melinda has given me and to see, okay, like where all of these like exercises and ways of thinking sort of fit in when it comes to solving this particular problem. Like there is a shift that you need to do once you figure out the specific problem you want to solve. And so that's sort of like what I've spent the intermediary time doing, right? Is sort of saying, okay, this is the very specific problem that I want to solve with brand strategy and like all the other experience that I bring into this. Then, okay, how do I shift these exercises? How do I shift my thinking to make sure that they're better at solving this particular kind of problem? What kinds of things can I think of? And that's another thing, right? Like the beta afterwards put me in a position where like I could make up exercises myself to solve some of these problems, right? And like that's not something I would have been able to do before the beta. And I will say this, like quote me anywhere, okay? The beta this boot camp was not my first brand strategy course, but it was sure as heck my last. Like I've not been tempted by a brand strategy course since. Like I really haven't. And like and so that and the reason for that is because like it's given me the tools and the skills to like be able to figure stuff out myself, right? Like I can create my own activities that will like fill in the gaps for like the problem that I'm trying to solve. Like I can do all of that. And that's what I did. And that's what I spent like the time between finishing the boot camp and now when I'm charging 22.5K, what for a project doing, right? Is like figuring that out and figuring out what configuration would be best and figuring out how to like articulate these things. All this is part of like positioning as well, right? So like just sort of like consolidating all of those things into, for me, a framework, because that's just the way my mind works. And like that keeps me comfortable having a framework that I can repeat and go back to and tweak and blah, blah, blah. I call it my theory of practice. And every time I do, like Nick laughs at me because he knows I'm a nerd. But like just sort of developing my theory of practice when it comes to brand strategy and creative direction and like just like this thing that I'm now doing in the world. So that's sort of like what I did to get to where I am. And like I promise any person who does that, right? Like any person who like gets this toolkit that you have, figures out the problem that they want to solve, and then like bridges the gap by sort of like looking back at what you taught them and figuring out how to bridge the gap, you're going to do well. You're going to do well. Like I can promise you that because like that's what's happened in my life. And I can't see any conceivable scenario unless you're like, I don't know, living under an authoritarian regime that like bans your specific kind of practice, which is entirely possible. And if that's you, I'm so sorry. This may not work. but but if you're not in that scenario, like I can't see any conceivable scenario where you're not going to succeed. So that like that's basically it. And then just figuring out how I want to run my business, right? Like just figuring out, okay, so like my practice is really rock solid. What do I want my business to look like, right? And that's sort of asking, what do I want my life to look like? Figuring out, okay, do I want to do larger services, smaller ones, right? Like, do I want to do products? Do I want a flagship? Do I want many off? Like, how do I want to shape my business practices so that they sort of inform the rest of my life? And so that's what I've been doing. And I'm pretty close. Like, that's the one that I'm still working on just like a tiny bit, but like, I'm pretty close. So yeah.
It sounds like you have the tools that you need to meet any problem that comes to you. Like, because I think a lot of, and at least this is where I was at too, and a lot of people I talk to, like they're looking for the right framework, the right way. Just give me the exact steps to do it.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you were able to take what was given to you as what it is just tools, but then the understanding of what those tools are used for in order to like mix and match and then solve any problem that does come your way. So yeah, it sounds like you're able just to like whatever problem does come, like the one, you were just mentioning, that you'll be able to use the tools that you have to solve those.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And like that's the secret. That's the thing that like nobody is telling you, right? Like people like nobody is telling you that like there is no framework, right? Like there are tools and the right framework is the right framework for you, right? Like often like you'll have gurus and folks sort of say like this is the definitive way to do XY thing, right? And I'm like, and I only realized this now after the beta, right? But I'm like, not really, right? Like that you are selling the way that you do it, and like you're selling like your own sort of materials that you've built up over time. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for somebody else, right? And so that's what I love about your approach, that it's so flexible, that you're sort of like, okay, here are the tools. Like this is how I know how to do brand strategy. Go and do brand strategy, go and practice it with other people, right? Because like you will run up against like friction where you're like, I don't know how I feel about this, or you'll run up against something that will like give you wide open spaces, and like feel that out and figure it out. And then like come time, you're going to start developing your own thing, your own practice. And like that's the best way to go about it. That's all the people that you admire, like that's what they did. They didn't take like wholesale somebody else's thing and say, cool, this is where I'm going to stay now. I'm just going to camp out here. This is it. Amazing. Right? Like, no, none of them did. They may have gotten like really good tools and really good base materials, and then they adapted those things until it became like their own idiosyncratic thing. And then once that happened, people were like, oh, yeah, that's cool. Haven't seen that. Click, 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 like fashion lights, right? and, and like that's what happened. That's what happened with all of those people. And so knowing that that's the path that you're going to need to take yourself to sort of create your own remarkable practice, I think it's really important. So yeah.